So I want to consider with you the fulfilled prophecy in Nineveh. We did several lessons on fulfilled prophecy last year, taking a look at how that's a fantastic piece of evidence for us that confirms that there's a God behind the Bible and confirms the Bible and its teachings itself. But I think I skipped over Nineveh. So we studied Babylon, we studied Egypt, we studied Israel, we studied Tyre and Sidon, but we never covered Nineveh. And so I think it's pretty timely that we can cover it here, and it works in well with what we're already thinking about and studying in our Minor Prophets study. So as we begin, I want you to note with me that the ancient city of Nineveh that's referred to in Jonah, it's referred to in Nahum, it's also, we're going to see it's referred to in Zephaniah. But that ancient city now lies near what we know as the current city of Mosul, Iraq. And that may not be a city that we're very familiar with simply because we don't really know much about world geography or cities or anything. But it may be one that you've heard of because of recent wars within the past decade that have occurred in Iraq. And news coverage has taken place in Mosul, Iraq, during some of those Iraqi wars. Maybe a city that you hear about more, as there's recently been some shots fired in Iraq and Syria with the United States within the past week. The ruins of Mosul, Iraq can still be visited today, though unless you're an Iraqi, I may not recommend a trip to Iraq right now. But these ruins provide for us a solid piece of evidence to give us further confidence in the inspired scriptures. Here is some drone footage of the city of Mosul, Iraq from above. This is just a Google Earth picture. And this is the ancient city of Nineveh that you see right here. A lot of it has not been excavated. A lot of it has not been built upon. A lot of it still sits empty, and they have built around it much of the city of Mosul, Iraq. You can actually see, if you'll take a look at this, a little connecting tributary river that connects to the Tigris River. The Tigris River is kind of off the map a little bit over here, but the Tigris River runs alongside this city, and this would have been some of this would have been waterway at one point in time. There was a moat at one point in time that was around the city, but that is the overhead picture. Google Earth has made it possible to have some pretty cool satellite pictures that weren't available just a couple of decades ago. Pretty neat when it comes to this stuff. But here's some other pictures that kind of might be helpful. If you look at, what's the city of Nineveh and how it's been reconstructed, this would be the Nergal Gate that you see right here on the map. But this is what it would have looked like, and this is part of an area that had been excavated and perhaps rebuilt and touched up to make it look more like the way it looked when it was original. You can kind of go around the city and notice here's another section of the wall that would have surrounded Nineveh at one point in time, and another entryway and gate there. You can keep going. This mound, can you see this mound that they're on top of here? Well, there's a wall and remains of a wall that are probably underneath that huge mound. And you can see how far that mound goes. That was the outside of the city of Nineveh. And it's just been covered up with dirt. And if you didn't know the city of Nineveh was there at one point in time, you wouldn't even know that there was a wall and the remains of a wall underneath of that. But that's what's underneath all this dirt. It's just a bunch of rubble, a lot of clay pottery shards, a lot of brick that's been torn down and basically just covered up with dirt. So that's that section of wall. That's kind of where he's standing right there, is in that area. You see on that picture. Here's another picture here of yet another gate to the southeast of the city. So that's what this section of wall that has been excavated looks like here. You can see a lot of the dirt piles that they've pulled off of some of those walls. Another section of the city, perhaps a parking area where people can park to come tour and take a look around. Another main palace area. Another gate right here on the northeast corner of the city. So you can still, as I mentioned, still go visit these remains. I think if you look in the background, look how kind of enormous that area is back behind it, that's just all barren. No one is there now at all, and it's been largely unexcavated. So I want to think about this city with you. That's another aerial view. You can kind of see the outline of the city right here. This would have been kind of the outline of the ancient city of Nineveh here. This is the Tigris River that I mentioned earlier that runs alongside of the city, and that's going to come into the lesson here in just a moment. Well, Nineveh was mentioned in prophecy multiple times in the Old Testament. First time that we see it in prophecy was with Isaiah, who wrote around 740 to 700 BC. And he says this in Isaiah chapter 10, verses 12 through 14. He says, "When the Lord has finished all his work on Mount Zion and on Jerusalem, he will punish the speech of the arrogant heart of the king of Assyria and the boastful look in his eyes. For he says, by the strength of my hand I have done it." He credits himself for his success, and he gives no credit and glory to God. He says, "By my wisdom, for I have understanding. I remove the boundaries of peoples and plunder their treasures. Like a bull, I bring down those who sit on thrones." And if you study Nineveh and the Assyrians, they did conquer many other peoples, and they were, for a while, militarily successful and very violent as well. He says, "My hand has found like a nest the wealth of the peoples, and as one gathers eggs that have been forsaken, so I have gathered all the earth, and there was none that moved a wing or opened the mouth or chirped." And so Isaiah says God's going to bring down that haughty and arrogant king, the king of Assyria. So the king of Assyria would have likely been located in Nineveh, certainly at one point in time. Zephaniah also mentions Nineveh. We're not going to talk about Zephaniah as much tonight, and he doesn't talk about Nineveh as much as Jonah or Nahum, but he does mention it in Zephaniah 2 and verse 13. It says that he will stretch out his hand against the north and destroy Assyria. That's God. He's going to destroy Assyria, and he will make Nineveh a desolation, a dry waste like the desert. Herd shall lie down in her midst. All kinds of beasts, even the owl and the hedgehog, shall lodge in her capitals. A voice shall hoot in the window. Devastation will be on the threshold, for her cedar work will be laid bare. Much of Nineveh at one point in time was also somewhat forested. You can see it's very deforested now. This is the exultant city that lives securely, that said in her heart, "I am, and there is no one else." What a desolation she has become, a lair for wild beasts. Everyone who passes by her hisses and shakes his fists. So that's what Zephaniah says is going to take place in Nineveh. He prophesies that in 625 BC. And then we have Nahum, who prophesies perhaps somewhere around 625 to 612 BC. So a little later than Isaiah and Zephaniah. And Nahum says this in chapter 1, 1 through 3, an oracle concerning Nineveh. That's what Nahum's all about. When Jonah prophesies, he calls upon Nineveh to repent, and Nineveh does repent, and God relents from destroying Nineveh when Jonah prophesies to them. But Nahum comes around later, perhaps over 100 years later, after Jonah, and Nineveh's apparently gone back to their wicked and evil ways, and Nahum has some bad news for Nineveh. He says, the book of the vision of Nahum of Elkosh, the Lord is a jealous and avenging God. The Lord is avenging and wrathful. The Lord takes vengeance on his adversaries and keeps wrath for his enemies. The Lord is slow to anger and great in power, and the Lord will by no means clear the guilty. His way is in whirlwind and storm. The clouds are the dust of his feet. So that's the prophecy of Nahum. Now, take all these prophecies together, and here's what you get. I've broken it down to 9 different prophecies. Number 1, you get this. The great city of Nineveh is going to be destroyed. Pretty simple. Nineveh is going to be destroyed. You also get, secondly, it's going to be captured when its city leaders and rulers are drunken. It's going to be captured when its city leaders and rulers are drunken. Notice Nahum 1 and verse 10. They are like entangled thorns, like drunkards as they drink. They are consumed like stubble fully dried. He says in Nahum 3 and verse 11, you will be drunken, you will go into hiding, you will seek a refuge from the enemy. And so there seems to be some allusion here to the drunkenness of the people of Nineveh, somehow going to be associated with its downfall. We learn also from Nahum that its destruction is going to be total. Nahum chapter 1 and verse 9. What do you plot against the Lord? He will make a complete end. Remember, Nahum's oracle is about Nineveh. This is about Nineveh. God is going to make a complete end. Trouble will not rise up a second time. So God is going to destroy Nineveh. It's going to be a complete and grievous end. Number 4, the Assyrian threat is not going to rise up a second time against Judah. When you study the divided kingdom, Israel and Judah, we know that Israel was taken into captivity by the Assyrians, and that would be the capital of Assyria, would have been Nineveh. But when Judah was taken into captivity, they were not taken into captivity by the Assyrians. And part of that is a fulfillment of this prophecy that they would not rise up against Judah a second time. It would be a different nation who would come in and take Judah into captivity. And that was the Babylonians, the Chaldeans. So Nahum 3 verse 19 says, there is no easing your hurt. Your wound is grievous. All who hear the news about you clap their hands over you, for upon whom has not come your unceasing evil. Once Assyria was destroyed, they would not rise up again. Your wound is grievous. It's deadly. You're done. You're not going to destroy Judah again. Someone else is going to do that. There's also some indication in these prophecies that the flooding of the river would be a factor in the overthrow of the city. And that's why we point out the Tigris River, because it's connected to biblical prophecy. In Nahum 1 and verse 8, it says, with an overflowing flood, he will make a complete end of the adversaries and will pursue his enemies into darkness. And then it says in Nahum chapter 2 and verse 6, it says, the river gates are opened, the palace melts away. So there's some allusion to river, to a flood, something watery is going to take place when Nineveh is destroyed. You also see a reference to fire. That's going to be associated with the overthrow. Nahum chapter 2 and verse 13 says, behold, I am against you, declares the Lord of hosts. I will burn your chariots in smoke. The sword shall devour your young lions. I will cut off your prey from the earth. The voice of your messengers shall no longer be heard. And then notice chapter 3 and verse 13. Behold, your troops are women in your midst. The gates of your land are wide open to your enemies. Fire has devoured your bars. So there's going to be flood and there's going to be fire. And that's going to be part of what leads to the destruction of Nineveh according to biblical prophecy. And then Zephaniah mentions the city is going to become desolation. The city is going to become dry. It's going to become like a wilderness. Zephaniah chapter 2 and verse 13 says. It says that we're talking about God and how God is going to use nations to do this, but he will stretch out his hand against the north and destroy Assyria. So there's no doubt about who we're talking about here. We're talking about Assyria. And then he gets more specific. He will make Nineveh a desolation, a dry waste like the desert. Chapter 2, verse 13. 2 more prophecies. After he makes it a dry waste like the desert, shepherds are going to bring their flocks to lie down there. Now, you wouldn't have been able to imagine that when Nineveh was in its power. There were people there. There were soldiers there. There was a palace there. It's not a place where you brought your sheep to let them lie down inside the city gates of Nineveh. But there's going to be a time, Zephaniah says, that herd shall lie down in her midst. The destruction is going to be total. It's basically just going to become an empty, desolate field, a wilderness. And all that's going to be there, just kind of wild animals or animals that are being led to new pastures by shepherds. Herds will lie down in her midst, all kinds of beasts. Even the owl and the hedgehog shall lodge in her capitals. A voice shall hoot in the window. Devastations on the threshold. All right, and then number 9. Those who pass by Nineveh will hiss and wag the hand in amazement at the ruin of the city. This is going to be just shocking to people who realize and remembered the powerful city of Nineveh. That's the idea. And so Zephaniah 2 and verse 15, everyone who passes by her hisses and shakes his fist. They're just shocked at how Nineveh has been brought to desolation. So here are the 9 prophecies then that come from Nahum and come from Zephaniah and also the Isaiah text that we mentioned. Great city of Nineveh is going to be destroyed. It's going to be captured when its city leaders and rulers are drunken. Its destruction is going to be total. The Assyrian threat is not going to rise up a second time against Judah. The flooding of the river is going to be a factor in the overthrow of the city. Fire is also going to be associated with the overthrow. And the city is going to become a desolation and dry. It's going to become like a wilderness. Shepherds are going to bring their flocks to lie down there. And those who pass by Nineveh are going to hiss and wag their hand in amazement at the ruin of this city. Does this happen? These are some of the things that are prophesied that are going to happen. Does this happen to the great city of Nineveh? Well, it does. The Nineveh prophecies, all of them have been fulfilled. Let's start with number one. The city of Nineveh is going to be destroyed. Well, that was fulfilled in 612 BC. Nineveh fell after being attacked by the Babylonians, by the Scythians, and by the Medes. And so Nineveh did fall. This is documented on a Babylonian chronicle that is housed in the British Museum. And that's a picture of the chronicle right there. They've learned how to translate this. A lot of people didn't understand how to translate cuneiform and that sort of writing, but they've certainly cracked the code to that. And as they translate it, it indicates that that is how Nineveh fell, and that's when Nineveh fell. The Assyrian Empire as a whole, because Nineveh fell first, and then other areas of the empire were conquered, but the Assyrian Empire was thought to have been completely destroyed and fallen in 605 BC at the Battle of Carchemish. And so, city of Nineveh has been destroyed. Syrians lost power completely just a few years later. It's a really good book by Austin Henry Layard, at least if you're interested in someone's travel documentary and interested in what someone has written who actually went and excavated the ruins. Austin Henry Layard did that back in 1848. So this book is 170-something years old. But he wrote a book, it's called Nineveh and Its Remains, about all of these sites. We showed you pictures of a lot of these sites as we started out the lesson. But he wrote a book about everything that he saw. In fact, there's a picture that's on the inside cover of this book. It's right here. It's a picture of them lowering the great winged bull that sat outside of one of these palaces. And Austin Henry Layard is the one who actually drew that picture from his excavations. But this book is written by him as an archaeologist and explorer that was hired by Britain to go excavate this city. And his book documents his travels to the ancient sites surrounding Assyria and Chaldean ruins, including Nineveh. And so a quick read, it's going to make it pretty clear. Nineveh was once a great city, and it's now in ruins. And he documents his exploration of that. So this has been fulfilled. This is another book that I found to be pretty helpful when it comes to archaeology by Alfred Hirth. But he says in archaeology in the Old Testament, he says in 612, the Medes and the Babylonians marched on Nineveh, the capital of Assyria. And on the third assault, the city fell, a fall that is vividly described by the prophet Nahum. A poorly preserved chronicle of the Babylonian Nabopolassar also gives detail as to the way Nineveh fell. Although remnants of the Assyrian army fled westward, they regrouped at Haran. They lost that position in 610, and for all practical purposes, Assyria had collapsed in 612. The Babylonians then took control over the area that had been within the Assyrian Empire. So Nahum was right. Nineveh was destroyed. Prophecy number 2. The city's going to be captured when its leaders and its rulers are drunken. There's a historian named Diodorus Siculus. He was a 1st century BC Greek historian, and he leaves a record of the fall of Nineveh. And he notes in that record that the king of Assyria was unaware of his deteriorating military position. He was a little overconfident in his power and in his position. He was over-aware of his victories against his enemies. And if you study some of the remains of the palace and the palaces, those were all documented in cuneiform on the walls of those palaces, where he brags about all of the places that he conquered and the cities that conquered and the people that he conquered, and what he did to those people and the kings that he captured. He liked to really brag about all of his accomplishments and all of his military victories. And because he was so overconfident, he prepared a feast of animal and much wine and drinking for his soldiers so they could just kind of rejoice and have fun. However, they ended up being defeated, so their arrogance came back to haunt them. The Babylonian Chronicle actually notes the final siege on Nineveh only lasted 3 months. And the Chronicle adds, the victors carried off much spoil from the city and from the temple area, and they turned the city into a ruin mound and into a heap of debris. So they were conquered, they were completely conquered, and they weren't going to come back from that. Fifth prophecy is that flooding would be a factor in the overthrow of the city. So high flooding of the Tigris River did assist in the overthrow of Nineveh. The walls of Nineveh are made of mud brick. And so when things begin to flood and they begin to push up on that mud brick, it begins to wipe out those walls. And so we showed you some pictures of those walls at the start. Those would be very formidable before you had an Air Force and drones and the things that we have that kind of get over walls today. But in those days, it'd be very formidable to see a wall like that until the water came through to help you wipe out the walls during the flood. And so that was helpful. It caused breaches in the walls during an abnormally high spring flood. And Diodorus Siculus cites a prophecy that was in the land. And the prophecy stated this: no enemy will ever take Nemus by storm. It's interesting that Nemus sounds a lot like Nimrod. If you read Genesis chapter 10, the Table of Nations, Nimrod was credited with being the one who built Babel, Calneh, Nineveh. And so that's why some of those names sound kind of familiar. But their prophecy said, no enemy's going to take Nemus or Nineveh by storm unless the river shall first become the city's enemy. This isn't a biblical prophecy. There was some sort of prophecy they had in their land. Well, he goes on to say that an enemy did try to take Nineveh, but after 3 years and heavy rains, the river, swelling wide, broke down a distance of the city walls and flooded a portion of the city. The king panicked, believing the aforementioned prophecy had been completed. He remembered the prophecy. He sees the floods and he thinks, oh, now it's happening. Our enemy, the flood, is going to defeat us. And so he gave up hope. He basically quit. He ordered his kingly possessions as well as his concubines into a portion of his palace. He sealed off that palace and he burned the whole thing down. What did we say two of the prophecies were? It's going to be destroyed by flood. There's also going to be fire and burning that's involved. And he burns his own palace down. The siegers learned of the break in the wall. They attacked at that point. They forced entry into the city, and they took over as victors of the whole city. And the enemy general was crowned as its king, and he was given supreme authority. So just like Nahum and Zephaniah had said, there's going to be water and flooding involved in the overthrow. Some of the people in the city are going to be drunken and not ready to respond to the problem. And then there's going to be fire. All those things are included when you read some of the history of the overthrow of Nineveh. Diodorus Siculus goes on to write, he says, he, the king, I think I already quoted that, didn't I? Why did I quote it again? I don't know. I should probably double check my PowerPoints before I come up here and preach them. Anyways, McDowell quotes some of this in Evidence That Demands a Verdict. Exact same quote. Okay, number 7. This city is going to become a desolation and dry. It's going to become like a wilderness. So Zephaniah chapter 2 and verse 13 indicates that. And so take a look at what the Wycliffe Historical Geography of Bible Lands writes on this. He says, the destruction of Nineveh was final when Xenophon and his 10,000 Greeks fought their way through the wilderness and mountains to the Black Sea. They passed the ruins of Nineveh, but were not aware that some 2 centuries earlier, the greatest city of the world had stood on the site. Xenophon does not even mention Nineveh. An Englishman, Sir Anthony Shirley, journeyed in the east at the close of the 16th century and observed Nineveh, that which God himself calls the great city, has not one stone standing which may give meaning to the being of a town. It's because a lot of those stones were covered up in dirt and mud. Just looked like a big open barren space. So this is what explorers found about Nineveh, which was the capital city of a major world empire when they explored it years later. Didn't even look like a city, had hardly been there. Just a big open barren area. Shepherds would bring their flocks to lie down there. I'd like to read, Farrell Jenkins actually mentioned something about this from when he went and visited the ruins of Nineveh himself, but he mentions that he remembers seeing shepherds with their sheep grazing upon the ruins of the ancient world capital. The picture that you see above, this is actually a depiction of sheep grazing on a site about 70 miles south of Mosul in El Hatra, where there was also a powerful fortified city. It was an Assyrian stronghold, as the ruins depict. This is not Nineveh, but it is an Assyrian city. Fortunately, back in 2015, ISIS began destroying many artifacts from the ancient city of Mosul as well as El Hatra. They even began bulldozing the ancient gates in one section of Nineveh so that they could install a road. And they ignored the fact, ISIS did not care, that this ancient site of Nineveh was named a World Heritage Site back in 1987 and was supposed to be untouched. No one was supposed to be messing with the ancient city, but ISIS didn't care. And they tore up a lot of the remains, and they went into museums and just tore up a lot of the Babylonian and Assyrian remains. And perhaps you remember news clips about that back in 2014, 2015, 2016, when some of those things were happening. Well, the last thing was just simply this. Those who passed by Nineveh were going to hiss and wag their hand in amazement at the ruins. It's pretty amazing, isn't it, that the king's palaces, this is where the king lived, had all of his concubines, all of his treasures, all of his amazing walls and winged symbols. It's amazing that the king's palaces and the walled city and the capital of a world empire, it's now just an empty field with its walls covered in dirt. Can you imagine that occurring in our own nation's capital? I thought it was kind of actually scary when you look at how Nineveh is shaped with the Tigris River next to it. And then you think about Washington, D.C. and the Potomac River going right next. It looks so eerily similar. But can you imagine Washington, D.C. and all of the buildings that we recognize and people go visit and people admire? Can you imagine all of that being torn down and just covered in dirt one day? That's what it was like for people who remembered ancient Nineveh. And for God to be right on target with all of these things being accurately and completely fulfilled with the destruction of Nineveh was indeed amazing. People would just wag their hand and say, "This is incredible. I can't believe this." Well, for us today, here's what it teaches us. God knows history before it happens. God knows history before it happens. And this destruction of the city of Nineveh and all the details of its fulfillment are evidence to us that there is a God behind the Bible and that the Bible is accurate. And if it's accurate about things like the city of Nineveh or some of the other cities that we've read about, it's also accurate as it predicts what will happen in the future. One day this earth is going to be destroyed and all that is in it. And then one day all of us are going to stand before God in judgment. And there are going to be two choices. There are going to be two places where you can be sent. It's heaven or that's hell. And if God was accurate about all these things concerning Nineveh, you need to trust him as being accurate concerning your eternity. He's given you the option by sending his son to earth to change your eternity. You don't have to be destined for hell anymore. He sent his son to save you, so that you could be destined for heaven and a place with him where there's no more sorrow, no more pain, and no more crying. And if you haven't trusted in his son yet and been obedient to him, then you're not ready for what's going to happen in the future. So we're here to help you get ready.